everyone, and welcome to our first session of Revolution School. We appreciate you coming to join us today in this educational collaborative where we'll be discussing some different leftist revolutionary ideology from the points of views of, excuse me, different people who have studied these texts and these works of previous revolutionaries. It is impossible to have a perpetual revolution without first educating the people. Otherwise, of course, you just end up replacing your oppressive class. So doing our part as revolutionaries to help build further revolutionaries, we wanted to make sure that we could help engage in some accessible entry-level dialogue for those who are curious about any type of leftist politics or ideology. So without much further ado, I would like to move on to our first speaker, um, Christina. So she's coming on now. Hey, all right, I will let you introduce.
There we go. Hey everyone, my name is Christina Crutchfield. I am really passionate about housing and land use. So my personal background, I have a undergrad degree in urban studies and a master's degree in city and regional planning. And as I've studied throughout the years, what I've found is that there's a direct link between the way that we do housing and how people of color advance in the United States, how people of color, particularly Black and Brown people, and in Memphis, particularly Black people, advance or don't advance because of federal policies and local policies that have kept us behind, have kept us from advancing further. So what I want to share with you guys today, I'm calling it the land of the free for those who can afford it. And it's just an overview of American land use, housing, and capitalism and how that all works together. So, my favorite TV chef, Gordon Ramsay, he yells at people, he's a little bit crazy. He always says, don't ever deconstruct if you can't even construct. What he means is don't take things apart that you don't know how to put back together again. And so my goal for today is just to take us through U.S. history, a very broad overview, and then look down and see how land use that the U.S. government has repeatedly put one group of people in power, and then at the expense of other people over and over and over again. And then what we can do, and then what the reality of that we're facing at the end. That's what I hope to go through. I'm using this model. So what we know of inequality is just that things aren't fair, that there's unequal access to opportunity. There's equality where you get the same tools distributed, but they're not really fair. There's equity, which is a piece that I think a lot of people are moving towards now, just now moving towards, which is maybe some people need a little bit more help than others. And then there's justice, which I hope that we can move, or I hope that this revolution, that this movement is moving towards. And that is that we need to fix the system that caused all the inequality to begin with. So I'm about to start with two very unpopular opinions. Unpopular opinion number one is land ownership is a myth. I know some of you guys are gasping right now, but quick question. If you own property in the United States and you don't pay your rent, AKA your property taxes, you're gonna get evicted, right? So how can you own something if somebody can come in at any time and say, like, you owe me this much money to stay here? Or how do you own something in which the government says that you cannot do this, or this on it if it's something that you truly own? That is my first unpopular opinion. Hang with me. Hopefully it will make sense as we go on. Second unpopular opinion is middle income housing is also just a myth. So we have this idea that if you live in the suburbs, if you live in a nice place, in a nice community, that's middle housing, and aren't poor, but you're not one of the wealthy, I'm here to show that the gap between middle income and like actual wealthy housing, stock, and investment is so great that middle income might as well be low income. Hope y'all don't hate me so far. So I believe in defining your terms. So one term that I need for everyone to understand is this thing called land tenure. Land tenure is a system in which a land is owned by an entity who is said to hold the land and determine who can use that land and for how long, under what conditions. So basically how we use land, it's what the land tenure is. It's a system in which the land is owned by an entity. So there's different types of land tenure. Traditional indigenous land tenure is something that I'm personally a fan of and believe we should go back to. That is stewardship over the land rather than control of the land. So instead of thinking that I actually own this, instead I'm thinking that I am a steward over it, and that's my purpose. That's how I'm rolling through everything. Allodial title is what I described at the very beginning, and that doesn't exist. It almost never happens, and that's pure land ownership, completely free of taxes. The government can't come in and say you can't put a fence in your yard. That's allodial title. It doesn't exist. Feudal land tenure, which I believe, and I'll talk a lot about, is just another version of what we have in the United States. It's that you have a royal or noble class of people who allow access to the property and to its subjects. So you have this overarching sovereign that gives permission for people to use land through a noble class. The life estate, this one you don't really need to know, but I just like it. Is you can live there till you die, but you don't own anything. The way I like to think of it is Alfred at Wayne Manor. Like Alfred could probably, in Batman, like he can probably live at Wayne Manor till he dies, but will Alfred ever own Wayne Manor? No. FEUDAL, another one you don't really need to know, is non-transferable inherited land. Way I like to explain it is when Meghan Markle's husband decided that he didn't want to be a Prince no more, he decided he didn't get to take his land titles with him. That's what that holds. More seriously, leasehold is what we think of our traditional lease system here in the United States. And again, I'm here to talk about how it's just a baby version of the feudal land tenure. And then common land is important for us to understand. It's a concept that we pretend that we don't understand in the United States, but we do. And that's land that is owned by the state for the use of the public. So think parks and streets, they're both owned by your local municipality, but like the public can use them, and that is even possible for housing. Okay, so the feudal system, in case y'all forgot, in case y'all have not looked at this since high school. In the feudal system, a royal, the king, who believes he is sovereignly appointed, gives land entitled to nobles, this noble class, and the noble class provides land and legal protection from them to the peasants or the lower class. And this peasant class can then go on and rent. Like if I'm poor, I can have a poor person rent for me, and on and on and on and on. And that fancy word for that is subinfeudation. So another way to look at it is this way. So you have the sovereign, the king. He appointed Lord Rigsby, I just made this up, to be over the land. Lord Rigsby can rent out to Mr. Darcy and Mr. Jones at the expense of the local blacksmith, the grocer, the farmer. That's how it works. So it's appointed land that benefits the middle group somewhat at the expense of a lower income, lower class driven people. So what does that mean in the United States? How to be a decision maker in the United States about land use? Well, up until 1792, you couldn't be Jewish, Catholic, or a Quaker. Up until 1820, you had to be a landowner. Up until 1920, you had to be a woman. And up until 1965, you couldn't be a person of color. So if you look at our total popular vote for president as a percentage of the total population, we have two major jumps. This jump and then another jump over here. I don't know if you can see that. But the second jump is actually the jump when women and people of color were given the right to vote, unoppressed. That's the second jump. But I want to talk more about the first jump. Around 1820, when land ownership was no longer a requirement to vote. And you might say, Christina, well, like that was only 44 years from the founding of the country until that requirement was lifted. But in those 44 years, there were policies that were put in place that affect the way that we use land and that we see housing today. So real life federal policies, 2 months after the United States was founded, the Congressional Act of 1776 gave people who served in the Continental Army bounty land as a reward for serving in the Army. That will come back later. In 1785, and then again in 1800, the introduction of buying federal lands for cash or credit were introduced. So the way that our buying land for cash, buying land for credit systems go back far before people who didn't own land had the right to vote. The Intrusion Act of 1807 was our country's very first anti-squatter law. And the Land Act of 1820 was like, okay, maybe we shouldn't do federal credit, but what we can do is confiscate them. So the ability for the government to confiscate land, to kick out squatters, to sell or buy in the manner that they choose, to create the prices in the manner they choose, were all established before non-landowners had the right to vote. So in early America, Southern feudation looked like wealthy landowning white men giving land, allowing wealthy landowning white men and also slightly less wealthy white men to own land at the expense of Native peoples, African slaves, poor white farmers, immigrant workers. And that has been like the blueprint of how America has done housing forever. So these early American policies cemented the relationship between land use and capital. So fast forward a lot up until Reconstruction, industrialization, and during that time in the way that we did decision making. So after slavery, Black people in particular began to thrive as a group, kind of. We created our own cities, we created our own industries. During industrialization, we had a huge input of poor Black people being able to work in factories and moving into cities. We started urbanizing as a people instead of getting out of agricultural industries and moving more into industrialization. And as we started moving into these Black communities, because I remember everything was very segregated, we started to thrive. You remember Black Wall Street, you remember a lot of different things that came here in Memphis. We had Robert Church, who is a Black Memphis real estate tycoon, who literally built an empire of land owning. And what he did with it that was so remarkable is he gave mortgages to Black people, in which no other people were doing. And Memphis started to grow and thrive and shine. And you had all these other cities who were doing the same thing, where Black people were starting to really advance as communities. And then white people burned it down, quite literally. So the first picture is of the burning of TOFA, Black Wall Street, a Black wealth capital was burned. And then the other one is the race riots of Springfield, Illinois. We're literally poor-ish white people in the power class, the upper power class, had made it so that if Black people were becoming wealthy, then that meant it was an assault on their position and where they were. So they had to destroy it in order to keep their position. Fast forward, not that much, like 20-ish years, our Memphis didn't start redlining until 1940, but the National Housing Act of 1934 actively encouraged legal mortgage discrimination. So it said, if you live in one of the areas that are blue and green, you can get a mortgage. If you live in one of the areas that are red and yellow, you cannot. And the people who lived in red and yellow house or areas of this map, this is the real life redlining map for the city of Memphis, they were not able to get housing at all. Like they could build housing. And what's crazy and kind of really cool is that Black people went through all of this and still built whole communities after that. 1944, GI Bill said, go to war and get a house unless you're a Negro, basically. So the GI Bill promised that if you go to war, if you fight in World War II, that you can get a house. Except for when Black people fought and came back and were like, where's my house? There was no answer. There was no recourse. There was like, oh yeah, well. And that perfect storm of newly founded white homeowners in white communities getting wealth and advantages versus poor Black people who had fought in the same war, not having those advantages, and then saying that where their home was unmortgageable, like it wasn't a safe place to invest in. It's a perfect storm of like a self-fulfilling prophecy. Both redlining and discrimination through the GI Bill regulated most African Americans with Black folks to concentrated areas within the city. And then what the city did is decided that those areas were declining in property values. The regulation of African Americans to those neighborhoods received no support, received like absolute over-policing, seem familiar, and hate, which created a picture to the outside world, to the white world, that these places were slums and the city was afraid of them. And how do you deal with slums is 1949 and 1954 urban renewal policy, which is literally knock them down, knock down the neighborhood. So every time Black people started to create wealth, the city or the government, the landowner, the big landowner, would come and knock it down every single time. So by the time that in Memphis, Beale Street was knocked down, including Robert Church's house, which was actually burned down by by the mayor at the time. The hate was that real. It was Black wealth could not exist. So in 1950s America, the people who the government gave power to itself to be decision makers for your land. If you got a GI Bill or you had a little green line around your house, you received benefits at the expense of Black soldiers, new immigrants, and people who could be considered the help. Like all of these things follow under the same model every single time. So I want to point this out really quickly. I know people are like, well, that was a long time ago. But for the record, it was completely legal to discriminate against someone solely based on their race until 1968. And then in 1971, Nixon was like, well, I can't make the suburbs integrate. And then in 2020, the president of the United States said, well, I can't make the suburbs integrate. So that's still a ongoing thing. In 97 or 1974 and 75, up until then, it was completely illegal to discriminate for creditors to discriminate based on race, sex, zip code, census tract, whatever they wanted to. So even though they couldn't say, well, I can't give you this house because you're Black now, they could definitely say, I can't give you this loan because you're Black. And then that went on basically until 1977 with the Community Reinvestment Act, which required banks to use anti-discriminatory policies in all practices. Problem is, in 2020, the president of the United States basically is trying to actively undo that policy. So where are we? We have all of these actions of inequality that we see, and then we have all of these actions trying to fix it with equality. We'll say, well, if you get this, well, then you get the same thing. But it isn't until much farther where we actually get into an equity conversation. Equity meaning like, hey, maybe these people need more. And it's very, very much farther until we start talking about justice. So it's not until we get into post-modernity, until the 1980s, until we start seeing the government think at all differently about how to do housing and land use. At that point, the government had created a relationship between community partnerships and local government, and kind of this cog of maybe if we work together, things could actually happen. And great things, absolutely undeniably great things came out of this time, like the community development block grants, almost the oldest housing organizations in the city of Memphis were all founded during this time, every single one. We have the Revitalized Community Reinvestment Act, which allows direct capital into low-income neighborhoods. And then you also had, like, land ownership became extraordinarily easy for anybody who wanted to buy a house. You could do it. Awful things came out of this time as well, including neglect of public housing. I don't know if any of you guys are familiar with Cabrini Green in Chicago and that story, but it was a huge public housing complex that was just left with no investment in it. And then you also have Hope 6, which I know some people will argue with me that Hope 6 wasn't that bad. It was. In the name of new urbanism, like urban renewal wasn't the same thing. And then you also had nonsense housing interest rates. Everything was deregulated. There was no order. It was pure chaos. And in order to access this system, you had to have a formal education of how the federal government works. You had to have some relationship with local government. You had to have some type of capital to be a part of the community partnership. Like it was very difficult, very complex system to operate. So during this time, up until 2000, from the 80s until 2008, like the people that the government decided were going to be in charge were local housing authorities. And that was local housing authorities were nonprofits, they were banks, they were private individuals who just wanted to have a house. And the people who were found like in the middle, trapped in the middle of it, were people who are like, hey, I have we have a double income and we can afford this. Maybe we'll rent out another property for somebody who may need it. And then for the first time in America, you find people who, families who needed a second income to survive, using land ownership as a way to create income. This is something that didn't really start like as on a personal, on a one-on-one level until the 80s. As I need you to rent from me so that I can survive, that mentality. Or the landlords have mortgages too concept. That's when that started. And it's all because of the system and how it was set up. And it was at the expense of low-income families, people who absolutely desperately needed housing, and then also single-income families. In 2008, there was the global housing crisis where 10 million people, 2 million Americans in particular, lost their homes. It was caused by all the things that I said before, where the deregulation of the financial industry. Its result is permitted banks to engage in hedge fund training or trading, and the results were kind of catastrophic. This is a really cool article that I suggest you look up. It's called When Wall Street is Your Landlord from The Atlantic. But it basically talks about how the government of Fannie Mae sold foreclosed homes to private equity groups and hedge funds. So literally Wall Street could be the one who's in charge of your home. So up until this past year, the people who were given the government gave decision making power to were private management groups. So people who had thousands of houses on their portfolio, and I don't know if you're noticing, but I hope you are, that the landlords, income makers, and receivers, and tenant parallels, the people who this is happening at the expense of, they're getting closer and closer. They're becoming the same group. So it's no longer, well, these people who own this land. No, it's Auntie Lulu who needs cousin JJ and them and Sam and the fam to come live with her so that she can help pay the bills. Man, little friend, we don't know what man, little friend does, but we don't care at this point because it's necessary for him to survive. And so there's this overarching, like, shrinking of the middle group, in which they are now just survivors. They're no longer the wealthy people that we started with. They're now just survivors. And so after 2008, after the housing crisis, we started moving towards equity. And equity looks like incentivizing housing, saying, hey, if you live in this neighborhood, we will give you money, or if you, if developers, you promise to put low-income housing in here, we will give you a tax break. That's called inclusionary zoning. Fun fact, that, which makes sense, inclusionary zoning is 100% illegal in the state of Tennessee. cannot do inclusionary zoning. You cannot say that a developer has to build housing for, have a percentage of housing for low-income folks. Affordable housing funds, which just is literally exactly what it says, keeping federal or state funds for the act of affordable housing. All of those things are equity solutions. And remember from our chart, equity doesn't fix the problem. It just gets people closer to the tree. One of my favorite equity solutions, this is just personally, is the idea of community land trust, where you own your structure, you own your house, but the land belongs to the community itself. And it separates like the idea of land ownership with community, or with my freedoms or my power making and my decision making. And it gives community the ability to have those types of conversations instead. So like I said, everything up until this point has been minded on inequality, equality, and then the last piece was just equity, things that we're doing to try to bridge the gap. But let's talk about justice. Things that it will take to fix the system. I think the number one thing that it will take to fix the system is housing first. It's having an understanding that the right to shelter is a basic human right, and then the people, us, making sure that like our government knows, is reminded that housing is a basic human right. So housing first. This model came out of people who were experiencing homelessness, and what they saw is that the normal cycle for someone who's experiencing homelessness is, well, we're going to try to get you into a shelter, and then maybe when you get into a shelter, we'll get you some like medical treatment or behavioral or mental treatment, whatever you need. And 9 times out of 10, there's no point of getting mental health if you're in a shelter. So like it makes people fail again. But maybe they're extraordinarily strong, and they are able to get from the shelter, get some help, and get into some transitional housing. Transitional housing is not a permanent address. How are you going to get a job if you don't have an address? So it's breaking housing as its own thing. Like, let's start with housing and then let people do with whatever they want. If you start with housing first, then people can live real lives. The problem that our government seems to have is that that is not affordable for private individuals who are going to be the ones lobbying against it. It takes the money out of that top group every single time. But housing as a right in the U.S. is not a new concept. The first time, I told you this is going to come back, in 1944, FDR in the State of the Union address declared that the U.S. had a second Bill of Rights, including the right to a decent home. This right he wrote that, or said that the exact same year as the discriminatory GI Bill was passed, the same year. So just because you say something doesn't mean that it's actually, your policies are actually the policies that happen actually include everyone. And in 1948, the U.S. signed a Universal Declaration of Human Rights, in which housing or shelter as a human right was listed, but the right was a non-binding declaration. So it's just a, look, we signed a paper. In 1966, the U.S. signed the International Covenant of Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, and in 2020, it still has never been ratified. So the actual covenant, the actual document saying that housing should be a human right is signed by the United States, has never been ratified. Between 1992 and 1994, there were 3 or 4 documents signed by the United States of the implementation of the International Covenant of Civil and Political Rights, again, documenting housing as a human right. And what the United States decided to do with it was like, well, I guess we can decriminalize homelessness. That's all we got. In 2010, the U.S. made a commitment to reduce homelessness and increase the accessibility to affordable housing. That, again, was a non-binding declaration. It was just something that was said. Nothing has happened. In 2016, the U.S. finally did it. The United States signed the New Urban Agenda, which commits to promote adequate housing for all as a component of the right to adequate standard of living. The current administration, this was signed by the previous administration, has never like has not talked about this and has actually broken relationships with the UN, which is where this comes from. So it's a nice talk, but what do we as practitioners do? What do we as revolutionaries do? We demand that like housing for all. We demand that housing is a human right, and we make sure that we do everything that we can in our power to make sure that these policies are being upheld, and these policies are being listened to. Now we're in a very unique time. There is a massive eviction crisis happening globally, but very much in the United States as a product of who we are as a nation. In the city of Memphis alone, in June, there were 9,000 eviction cases open for people who had lost homes in COVID-19. 9,000. Conservatively, nationwide, and this is including extremely high population density, and high renter density places like New York and LA, 25 million people. It's possible they'll be losing their homes through eviction. When I talked about the 2008 housing crisis, that was 10 million people. Conservatively, 25 million people are going to be facing eviction come December. This is a chart from the Aspen Institute that says that exactly the same thing, that 28 to 39, so this is 30 to 40 million people could be at risk of eviction after 2020. Now, luckily for now, the CDC has passed the legislation that says you can't evict people until December, but all that means is that people will still get evicted in December unless action is taken. And some of those actions, I'm actually going to go back. This is actually from protests that have been around the city, or the city and around the country, is continue the protesting, continue raising awareness that this is happening to a lot of people. And of course, who is this happening to? Again, it's happening to Black and brown people. It's happening to Black and Latinx renters and renters with children. 100% are the people who feel like they have no confidence that they can pay rent on time. So this is basically the end of my whole spiel. I think that true justice means dismantling the system that causes the disparity. In our way that we do housing, the way that we do rental, it's an injustice. And I'm lucky enough to be able to know and work with some amazing people who are doing this work. And I can share these names with you. But the National Community Reinvestment Coalition, they are in DC, and they are fighting all types of policies, lobbying for housing as a human right. National Urban League, Partnerships for Southern Equity, or a great group out of Atlanta, Transformation Alliance, Enterprise Community Partners, Partners for Dignity and Rights are one of my favorite groups, and they're out of Baltimore. National Low Income Housing Coalition, literally all they do is put out facts, and I love them for it. So yeah, I have a little bit more time, and I will open up the floor for questions if there are any.
Yeah, Christina, if you check the chat, there are a few.
Sure, I can share this presentation. That's one. Yes. How do you think housing issues will be affected by credit being flooded into the market to mask the current economic crisis? Are the revolutionary models for housing globally or historically? So I honestly, I think we're starting something new. I do not know, at least I'm optimistic, that the way that we will move past this is going to have to be revolutionary. I think that the current model for housing are not going to work. They're going to fail continually because they're based on a system that doesn't make sense. And so it's going to take creative thought. It's going to take creative, like forethinking and the powers that be to like create basically a new system. I think that the housing issues, okay, so people are getting evicted. Evictions go on your credit. Credit means that you can't buy and or rent, and you're going to end up in a nonstop cycle of like, I can't do anything, I can't live anywhere. There's going to be a huge, like a bigger housing crisis that follows. I hope that answers your question well enough. I see another question that I left. We ought to look at Philadelphia's revolutionary housing model with their encampments and organized squats and militant eviction defense. Yes, to all of the above. That's in the comments. Yeah, so other cities are doing that. They are just saying, no, we're not leaving. No. They have, Philadelphia is actually a really good example. And they just have encampments. Like I said, the right to kick out squatters happened before people who didn't own land had the right to vote. And organized, I would love to do organized squats when things are going on. I don't know if you saw the story here in Memphis, but a woman who was just diagnosed with COVID-19 like came home from the hospital and all her stuff was on the curb. That's the level of like chaos and madness that we're dealing with. My thoughts on the community land trust model, I think it's a really good equity play. I do not believe that it's a really good justice play. So the reason is, in order to do the community land trust model, you have to have capital. In order to do this like way of thinking, you have to have enough people who can buy into it to own, to have the community own the land. You have to have enough people who can buy into it to have the ability to build a house or have the ability to, I don't know, build a condo and then everybody owns their unit. That's all part of it. So it's a really good equity play if you like have the equity to do that, if that makes sense. Any other questions? Do you see a foreclosure crisis on the horizon? Absolutely. Absolutely, 100%. So unfortunately, like I said, those two bottom classes are becoming the same thing. They're becoming the same group. And so many landlords nowadays literally are using their rent to pay their mortgage. So if rent ain't coming in, their mortgages are going to fall, and you're going to have another foreclosure crisis. And I think just like the 2008 foreclosure crisis pushed us into working towards equity models, I'm absolutely hopeful that the 2020 like disaster of what's happening will force us to justice models. Wow, these are great questions. With justice, look, land back cosmology back to indigenous folks. We belong to the land, not the land belonging to us. I believe so. That's my personal belief, is that justice won't happen truly and freely until we break the ties between land ownership and capital. Until we can break that, we're going to find ourselves in the same model. Like right now, all of our public schools in the city of Memphis, well, in Shelby County, are funded by property taxes. So if my neighborhood, I live in a low to moderate income neighborhood, but basically low income neighborhood. We have our property taxes are not much, but our land values declared so much, or it's so low. We can't afford to fund our school. We can't afford to fund these things. And as long as our property values are tied, and our land values are tied to our system, our housing system, our educational system, we're going to find ourselves in this level of brokenness. So I would agree that I would love to see a push towards an indigenous model of own your house. Use your house for whatever utility that you feel necessary to, but it shouldn't be tied to whether you can work, whether you can live a normal life, of how much land that you own. Next question says, how can we push in our organizing for this justice model? How to your mind, can we engage in harm reduction without playing into of the equality equity framework. Absolutely. So, one, support the people who are doing the work. One thing that I would say, how do we engage in harm reduction is just being very cognizant of people are losing their life. People are losing their livelihoods because people work out of their homes. People are losing their like the way that they do lives in this fight. So life in this fight. So we have to go in with that like compassion minded and know what we're fighting for, and know that this is like too risky just to be an equality or equity thing, that we have to go in and demanding justice. And one of the easiest ways, I shouldn't say easiest ways because it's not easy at all. One of the best ways to demand justice is to be there, is to be in front of the crowd, to be at eviction hearings. We won't have another eviction hearing until December, but in December, in the cold, be there with the signs. I know people are like, well, demonstrating is so lame. Okay, it gets the message out. It gets the people to know and see what is actually happening, what gives them the reality of people that people can't grasp. I think that this is going to be so big that people aren't going to be able to ignore it. But I 100% advocate for advocacy. So to be in the rooms, to have the pressure on the people who are the decision makers in any way that makes sense. Does displacement happen because of incentivized housing? Absolutely. 100%. So if you put too much incentivized housing in a neighborhood, then those housing values then become affect the total land values and then the housing values of the surrounding neighborhood. And so if you're not careful, incentivized housing can cause displacement. Do you think homeownership is what we should be striving for, especially as it relates to future of housing? It's kind of hard. So I think that homeownership is how we survive in this current model. So I think if things were to remain the same, I would be advocating homeownership. I think that in the future, I would advocate homeownership, not necessarily land ownership. So I'm trying to figure out a good way to, like a condo. So like in a condominium building, you own your little part, your little lot, but you don't own the land. I think that for future housing, if I had absolute ownership of my little housing unit, whatever it may be, I think that would be good. But I want to definitely get away from like I need to own this parcel of land in order to do what I need to do. Yes, also keep listening, as Beta pointed out in the comments that there are a great group of revolutionaries who are doing eviction work right now. And you can keep listening to learn more about how you can be a part of that. I think that is the last question I saw, unless there's something else. Well, thank you so much for listening. Thank you for hearing me out. I'm glad that I got to spend the morning with you. I'm going to stick around as long as I can, but I actually have to be somewhere soon. So thank you all so much.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Christina. That was super enlightening. Perfect way, I think, to start off our series of panels here. So again, for anybody just tuning in, Christina just spoke on housing and racial capitalism. We are recording the webinar, so we will be able to get you guys to be able to see all the individual panels and their presentations, either on the Rev School website that will be debuting after this, or just through our social